Welcome to this very special month on the Tudor Travel Show. Now, if you've been following my recent Tudor road trip, or should I say Stuart road trip to Scotland, on social media, then you will know that this month I have something very special in store for you. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, throughout September we will be going Mary Queen of Scots crazy. And so, if you, like me, are fascinated by her story, then stay tuned throughout this bumper month because I have lots of wonderful places to share with you and stories to be told. Yes, indeed, this month, 477 years ago, on the 9th of September 1543, a baby girl was crowned Queen of Scots at Stirling Castle. Her name, of course, was Mary, and her life, its splendour and its tragedy would become legendary. Now, in commemoration of that happy event, I will be publishing one podcast a week through this month, and that starts today. We are fortunate enough to be meeting up with and hearing from 3 members of the Marie Stuart Society. Now, let me tell you what I have in store for you over the coming weeks. Well, in today's first episode, we are going to be touring Linlithgow Palace, of course, the place of Mary's birth, with Anne Daly from Mary's Meanders. And I'll be saying a little bit more about Anne and Mary's Meanders shortly. But in the meantime, let's move on to week 2, and we'll be visiting Stirling Castle, which was a place much beloved by the Stuart monarchy. And in so many ways, we can consider Mary's childhood home to be Stirling, as she spent more time there than anywhere else in Scotland before she was sent to France to become and to meet her destiny as the future French Queen. We'll be joined at Stirling by Elizabeth Manson, the president of the Marie Stuart Society, and she will be our guide as we explore the castle. Moving on to week 3, it is on to our first of 2 visits to Edinburgh. And we'll be meeting up with Jerry Ozaniak, a US citizen originally from Chicago, but who has been living in his beloved Edinburgh for many years. And he will take us on a tour down the Royal Mile from Edinburgh Castle towards the Palace of Holyrood, following in the footsteps of Mary as she was formally received by the citizens of Scotland's capital city on the 2nd of September 1561. Then it is on to the palace itself, to meet up with Elizabeth Manson once again. She will be recounting for us the gruesome and dramatic events surrounding the murder of Mary's much beloved secretary, David Rizzio. And then in our final episode in week 4, we visit the mighty and austere Edinburgh Castle, where else, where we get a privileged private glimpse into Mary's bedchamber and see the very place in which she gave birth to her son, the future James VI of Scotland and James I of England. Oh, my friends, it's going to be an epic adventure in time, and I hope you enjoy travelling along beside me as we hear about Mary's often turbulent life. But before we begin, I do though want to take a moment to extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to the Marie Stuart Society, and in particular our guides, who took time out to meet me on location and share their passion for Mary. Their time and hospitality was given freely and generously, and without their input, this series of podcasts simply would not have been possible. And in a similar vein, I also want to share my deepest appreciation and gratitude to Historic Environment Scotland, and in particular the fabulous Laurie Risk, who worked with me tirelessly through all the complications thrown up by COVID, so that we could get as much access as possible to the sites in question. Now, I'll be saying a little bit more about some of our guides and how you can support both the Marie Stuart Society and the work of Historic Environment Scotland later on in these podcasts. Now, also to help you visualise the places that we're talking about, I will be posting pictures that I took on site to accompany each podcast in my private Facebook group, which accompanies this show. It's called The Tudor Travel Show, Hitting the Road. And if you're not already a member of that group, you can request access now by searching for the group directly on Facebook. Or if you are listening to this podcast via Podbean, you can simply click on the link below, which is included in the descriptive text which accompanies the show. Okay, I think that's all I need to say. It's time to get this time-travelling adventure on the road. So, buckle up, hold on tight, and let's get started and travel to our first destination. And as I mentioned, in this first episode, I meet up with Anne Daly. Anne is both a member of the Marie Stuart Society, but she's also founder of Mary's Meanders. She runs tours exploring locations associated with Mary, as well as the hugely popular Outlander and her ancestry tours, should you have Scottish roots and want to delve deeper into your family history. You join me now as I meet up with Anne outside the Gatehouse of Linlithgow Palace. Well, here I am finally, and you can probably hear the excitement in my voice because I have been dying to get up to Scotland for months now, and COVID has not stopped me. So an intrepid Tudor traveller has made it across the border into Scotland, and I am here this morning just outside the Gatehouse of Linlithgow Palace, which is, of course, the birthplace of Mary, Queen of Scots. And I am meeting with Anne, who is a follower of the Tudor Travel Show.
Hello,
so
yes.
We've spoken before, but only online.
That's right,
So it's
right.
fantastic to meet you.
So very, very warm welcome to Linlithgow. And even before we start, I'm going to let you know that Linlithgow's motto, the town motto, is St Michael is kind to strangers.
Oh, well.
And we absolutely welcome everybody to our town.
Well, that's so
very
lovely.
Welcome.
And indeed, I've already had a very warm welcome here this morning, so thank you. But before we begin our tour, because what we're going to do this morning is we're going to have a walk around the grounds and talk about the early years of Mary here in Scotland. And as we go, I think you're going to be pointing out some of the most interesting features of the palace, what we're looking at, etc. So hopefully we'll be weaving a bit of story into a bit of architecture, which is just about my favourite thing in the world. But before we do that, maybe you just want to say a few words about yourself and introduce yourself.
Well, I'm Anne Daly, and I'm Scottish, as you can hear from my accent. And I have lived here in Linlithgow in the area for 25 years. I'm originally from Glasgow, so I'm a very proud Glaswegian, but my mother's heritage is from the Outer Hebrides, so I have a grand Gaelic Highland ancestry heritage as well. So I'm Scottish through and through.
You are, you're from all parts of Scotland.
I am. So, but Linlithgow here is my home now. My daughter was brought up here, and I'm very passionate about the town and its lovely history, and about the palace, and about Mary Queen of Scots, who I first fell in love with, became passionate about when I was 15 years old, when I read Antonia Fraser's book on Mary, Queen of Scots. That's what started my interest.
So a lifelong love affair with Mary.
It has been.
No better person in the world to show us around Linlithgow Palace. So let's begin our tour, because we are standing just in front of, in fact, just inside the gatehouse, or a gatehouse anyway, of the palace. And I noticed there's some very fine-looking heraldic emblems.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about those?
So this grand entranceway is not the original entrance to the palace. We'll see that later on as we walk round. This was actually built for James V, Mary Queen of Scots' father, by his Master of Works, James Hamilton of Finnart. And that name comes up a lot because he was very involved in James's building programme. He did a lot of the designs at Stirling Castle as well. So he designed this for James because the original entrance wasn't quite grand enough. And what we have over the entranceway here is the 4 heraldic honours that James himself held. The first one that you see is the Order of the Garter.
So let's go and have a look at these now. Okay. I see, yes.
So this is the Order of the Garter. So that was given to James by Henry VIII, really as a thank you for James eventually coming round to support Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon and marriage of Anne Boleyn. So that was his kind of reward for that.
I see, okay. Yeah.
The second one's the Order of the Thistle, which is the Scottish equivalent of the Order of the Garter.
That's like a dragon. Is that the dragon, or are we going from the other side?
No, we go this side. So this is St George. So this is the Order of the Garter, which you're aware of today. This one's the Order of the Thistle, and so this is St Andrew. Okay, so this was the original Order of the Thistle. It kind of faded a bit, and then it was brought back again by James VII, James II of England, and it still exists today, so people are still bestowed with it today. There's very few people outside of royalty who hold both of these, very few. I see. And these two are French at the time. So this one's the Order of the Golden Fleece. So this was the Bourbon family in France. So there was the two French families jockeying for power at the time. And this one eventually split into two and went Spanish and Austrian. And it still exists today as a Spanish honour. So James had that with his French connections. And this one's the Order of St Michael, which was the French kings. That was their order.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I remember reading about Henry VIII and Francis exchanging the orders with each other.
That's right. They all did that. And they even get that today. The people that have all these orders today are the royal families throughout Europe. And this one here is kind of interesting as well, because this is the Order of St Michael, and I tell this if there's children on the tour. So this is, you'll see the Order of St Michael there, and you'll see it's the fleur-de-lis of France, and then you can see around the outside here it has cockle shells. So the shells, these were the badges of the pilgrims, particularly going to Santiago de Compostela, and this here is, if you take nursery rhymes all have some sort of connotation in history or something like that. And the nursery rhyme that I'm going to refer to now is Mary, Mary, quite contrary. Now, there's various stories about this. There's one that refers to Mary Tudor. There's one that is just an anti-Catholic one, but the one that I obviously like the best and think it fits is Mary, Queen of Scots. So you get Mary, Mary, quite contrarian. She was quite contrary, the way she jumped from 9 to 9 kind of thing. How does your garden grow? How is your kingdom doing? With silver bells, and whatever version you look at, that's communion bells. So it was anti-Catholicism. And cockle shells, again, the pilgrims thing. And pretty maids all in a row. That was the Mary, Queen of Scots, 4 Marys, their 4 companions. So that's my favourite version of the story. I didn't know that,
so that's brilliant. Thank you for that. I'm going to see that in a different light.
There you are.
Okay, well, this is a sort of a like, I suppose, a barrel vaulted ceiling we're walking underneath.
And if you look up there, you'll see the seals with the stags and the lion rampant of Scotland.
Yes, quite worn now, but you can definitely make them out. Absolutely. And so we come through and we come outside of the gatehouse. Now, right in front of you is the palace, and it kind of hits you in the face.
Absolutely does. And if you just think about it, it hits you in the face now because it's a magnificent building. It's huge.
It is,
But just think about that back in the 14th century, when all that was around was little hovels and things like that, and it would hit you. And of course, it wouldn't have been like this. It wouldn't have been the bare sandstone. It would all have been plastered and painted. And had gold and absolutely stunning.
We've got to remember that, haven't we?
Have to remember that.
So
and when you go to Stirling, you will actually see a building the way it would have been. The Great Hall there has been replastered.
And we're going there this afternoon.
So you can see there. And one of the things, and quite often you're doing this in exactly the right order, because I often recommend this to people, that Linlithgow Palace is a shell, but Stirling Castle's been completely restored.
Yes.
So you come here and you kind of use your imagination, try and work out what it would have been like.
I love using my imagination.
Great. Yeah, I like that too. And then you go to Stirling and you see how they interpret it all.
Yes.
So
let's just start. Can you tell us anything just very, very briefly about how a palace ended up here? Okay. Because it goes way before Mary Queen of Scots.
We're way back in the 11th, 12th century. So what was here was a hunting lodge, a wooden hunting lodge. So the time of King David, there was mention of some sort of building here. And it really came to prominence actually not with a Scots king at all, but with Edward I.
Right.
The King of England, the hammer of the Scots.
Indeed.
So he actually, while he was kind of ruling Scotland at one point, he built his hunting lodge here. And interestingly, the hunting lodge round it had a wooden palisade. So stakes, and even when we were children, we called things palings rather than railings, which was a term here. And that came into the term peel, pale peel. And that's why the park here is called a peel. It's not called a park.
Yes.
And something else interesting for that, if you were out of favour then, you were literally put beyond the pale, beyond the paling. So that's where that sign comes from, beyond the pale. But that's why we have a peel here. And this is one of only 2 royal parks in Scotland, the other one being Holyrood Park.
Okay, right.
So this is actually managed, it's managed by Historic Environment Scotland, but on behalf of the Crown.
Right. So that medieval building obviously got developed over time?
It did, it got developed over time. And then what happened was, basically, in 1424, there was a major fire in Linlithgow, and the whole town and the buildings here burnt down. At that time, it was called a castle. It was Linlithgow Castle.
Right.
It wasn't called a palace. And it was James I. Now, James I, and you can go into a whole story about that saga there, but basically, James I had been brought up in England. He'd been kind of kidnapped, and he was brought up in England, but he knew about the great palaces and things in England. So eventually his uncle, who was the bad guy there, when he died, he came back to Scotland to claim his crown, his throne, and he was aged 30 by this point, so he wasn't a youngster anymore. When he came back to Scotland, he decided he was going to build a grand palace. So he did. He was the one who built the first of what we know as Linlithgow Palace today. Probably 3 sides, maybe not 4, and it might have been 4, but nobody's dead
sure.
But
so we had to
we will see the original side that he built part of this side as well, but it's been remodelled over the years.
As these buildings always
they
were.
Always were, yes. But James I, he was the first one to build a palace here, and it was deliberately a palace, and they call it a pleasure palace. So it was for fun and entertainment, and it's exactly halfway between Holyrood Palace and
our feathered
Stirling
friends.
Castle. I know, they're always there. And so they would come here a lot, and it was a great favourite of the Stuart kings, and queens especially, because it was often given to them as their dowry. So the James II and the III didn't really do too much. The next one who really did something was James IV. James IV
that's Mary's grandfather, for those
Mary's
people.
grandfather. So James IV married Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, and that we'll come back to that later. But
please.
A lot of what he did, I think, was out to impress Henry VIII. Anything, he built a bigger ship and all this kind of thing. So I think it was out to impress him. So he remodelled. Did you go up into the royal apartments that are on the west side there?
Yes, we managed to sneak up there.
Yeah. So that was all his doing, and Queen Margaret's birth. So he did quite a lot. And then his son James V, Mary's father, what he did was more cosmetic, but he was responsible for the beautiful well, the fountain in the middle.
The fountain in the centre.
Yes, so that was James V.
I should just explain to everybody, obviously we're here in COVID year, and it's the end of the summer, it's the end of August. Most of these historic places have been locked down for several months. They're just starting to reopen. In fact, unfortunately, Linlithgow is not quite open, not for another week or so.
Shame.
So we are unfortunately missing out going on in the tour today. So we might be talking about some of the internal features that unfortunately we can't get up close and personal to. But nevertheless, we'll try and incorporate them as we go along. So can I just ask you though, because here we stand, we've got the kind of the porch, obviously, the entranceway into the palace, and then there's some beautiful tall windows. It looks like it should be a great hall. Is it?
No.
No. Okay, tell me more.
I'll just tell you a little bit more about the palace and why it is as it is now.
Yes,
so
please
it's worth
do.
doing that just quickly, because the palace was used for a number of years, right through Mary Queen of Scots' time, until James VI, her son. So when James became James I of England, he moved to London, and he only ever came back here once, and that was to oversee the repair work because the other side was falling down.
Right.
So the palace fell into disrepair then. His son, King Charles, was the last person to actually stay here, royal person to stay here.
That's when a lot of the Scottish palaces...
They did.
And it was the reason many of them are preserved, really, isn't it? Because they were almost just abandoned.
Yes, they were at that point. So, you know, so after that, like Bonnie Prince Charlie passed through here and things like that. But the Duke of Cumberland, Bonnie Prince Charlie's nemesis, he was stationed here with his troops on the way to the Battle of Culloden.
Okay.
And when they left their fires burning. And that's when the palace actually burnt down. So although it's got all its walls intact, all the stonework, there's no roof. Okay, so that's why it's been. So the palace you see today is more or less as it was in 1746. There's been no alterations or modifications done then, basically just kept in a state of repair.
And that's the beauty of it, isn't it? And I think that's what's so attractive to me as I was thinking of coming to Scotland, the fact that so many of the royal palaces have been lost in England, apart from Hampton Court, which half of it still remains as it was in the 16th century. But otherwise, a lot of them have been lost because people have been busy.
I mean, that happened here as well. I mean, there's various palaces, and they used to take the stones and build other things with them. But now Linlithgow's really, really intact. But going back to the windows you see here.
It's a chapel, is it?
It is a chapel.
Second guess.
Chapel, So that was remodelled as a chapel. This would originally have had the royal apartments. So when James IV built all the new royal apartments round that side, he modelled. In fact, when you're in the chapel there and you look up, you can see 3 different loo roof lines where it's been different things at different times. So it's a chapel. And if you're in there and if you're a great photographer, you can take, even I've managed to take it and it looks quite good, you can take the most stunning picture through one of those windows of that spire up there.
Well, now I should say behind us, we're standing facing the palace now in front of us, and behind us is the... Would you want to introduce it to us?
This is St Michael's Church. This is the parish church of Linlithgow. So St Michael's Church was built in the same time after the fire of 1424. It was built then. So it's been here as long as Linlithgow Palace. So when St Michael's Church was built, and it is still today the parish church of Linlithgow, when it was built it was a Catholic church because the country was a Catholic country at that time. Mary Queen of Scots was christened in here.
Indeed.
And when she was christened, I'll just tell you this just now, there are 3 bells in the tower in here. There's the Great Michael, the biggest one, there's a little one called the Meg Duncan, and there's the oldest one called the Alma Maria. That bell was there when Mary Queen of Scots was born.
How wonderful.
So if you hear the bell pealing out in that church, you'll know
what a
one
wonderful
of those
connection.
Pealed out when Mary Queen of Scots was born.
That's wonderful. So,
but the font in there is not the font that Mary Queen of Scots was christened in, because the Reformation came to Scotland while Mary Queen of Scots was in France, and it became a Protestant Presbyterian church. And at that time, you can see spaces where there would have been statues.
Yes.
All the statues were pulled down. Okay, so that's what happened then. A lot of pillaging and
I guess the font, etc., was just destroyed.
Yes, yeah. There is a place called New Battle Abbey that claimed to have one, but
okay. Well, since you mentioned the christening of Mary Queen of Scots, we'll continue to talk about the palace and the architecture as we go around. And what we're going to do is walk around the perimeter.
Yes.
And I suggest you may or may not be able to hear the slight sound of gardeners. They're busy preparing the palace for reopening in about a week's time. So we're going to do our best to dodge the noisy gardeners who are strimming the grass. But yes, you mentioned the christening of Mary Queen of Scots. So maybe now's a good time to talk about her birth here. So can you tell us about, when she was born and what was going on, etc.?
So Mary was born on the 8th of December. That's the official date she was born on. There is some debate as to whether she was maybe actually born on the 7th, but the 8th was chosen as it was, a feast day. And more important date. But the 8th of December is the official date. Now, it was a particularly harsh winter here, and it was very, very, very heavy snow. So it was, not good. Mary, her mother, Marie de Guise, was here in Linlithgow Palace. Her father wasn't here. He had just come back from, he hadn't been at the battle, but the Battle of Solway Moss had just been fought, and he was ill. Nobody seems quite sure what he had, maybe a dysentery or typhoid, but he was very melancholic, which was a trait of the Stuarts. They seemed to suffer from great depressions and things, and Mary went through that as well. And I'll maybe come on to that in a bit, but for whatever reason, he wasn't here and he died shortly afterwards. So Mary's birth was really quite subdued here at Linlithgow itself. And her christening is not recorded. Basically, she was christened at St Michael's Church, unlike the christening of her son, which was a grand affair at Stirling, and there's loads of records of the feast and everything they had. So it was all together.
So
her father died very low key, very subdued.
Okay.
So I'll tell you more about the story behind that later when we go down here. But I've just come across here to, this is a beautiful statue, a bronze statue of Mary Queen of Scots. And she's situated here, and she's actually looking right over into the very room where Mary was born.
She is, isn't she? We're just standing back from the palace. There's a lot of grassland as part of the peel, as you say, surrounding the palace. And we're now, which corner is this? What is this? North? This south?
This is the south.
Right.
This is the West Range. And
so
she was born just down right the far corner. There.
Right, so we're kind of southeast corner. We can see the south and the West Range. You can see the tower block, as you say. So Mary's looking directly at it, and it's a beautiful statue. Do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
So this statue was, the money was raised and the statue was put up by the Marie Stuart Society, who are the kind of font of knowledge of all things.
They are indeed.
So it's cast bronze by a very well-known sculptor called David Annand, and you can actually, if you want, go online. There's a video showing you about the making of the statue. That was all recorded.
How wonderful!
So the money was raised. The statue was put up there. So I think it's 4 or 5 years ago. It says it on it. So the statue was carved, and the plinth underneath, 2015, 5 years ago. Gosh.
Time flies.
I know. So the statue was supposed to be unveiled. I was very excited about this because, as I said, my first introduction to Mary Queen of Scots was Antonia Fraser. She was supposed to come and unveil the statue, but she was, unfortunately, she's very elderly now, so she was too ill to come. So instead we had, which was a nice touch, we had our local gala queen.
I see.
The young girl.
Yes.
And one of the participants in our local gala is always a Mary Queen of Scots, so they came and they unveiled the statue. But it's very, very beautiful.
And it's got her motto on the
side. It has on it, so it's got "My heart is my own," and round the other side it's got "On my feet is my commencement." So "In my end is my beginning."
Ah, yes.
So that's round here as well.
That's wonderful, isn't it? So there you go. Ma fin
and the plinth was carved by one of the Historic Scotland young apprentices, stonemasons, a girl.
Wonderful.
Yes, so
excellent.
She did that,
So let's walk over towards, we're following Mary's gaze now, and we're walking across the grass with, as you say, the west. I keep getting
this is the west.
Yeah.
It's very hard to, So this is the west wing. So the west wing, you know,
the west wing.
Yes. So this was the wing that you see today, and you can almost see, if you look very closely, if you look just next to the lightning conductor thing there, you can see where the stonework changes.
You can indeed. It's like when you tune into it, you can definitely see that something's been added on.
Yeah. So he built all these royal apartments here. And if we just pause here a minute, because before we get down there we won't see that. So these are all the royal apartments, the presence chambers and all that kind of thing. and they were very, very grand in their time. And he also built the tower that you can see there, and that's known as Queen Margaret's Bower. So James IV was marrying Margaret Tudor. So he he was quite a bit older, and she was 14 years old, so she was young, but she was a pawn, as they all were then. And she had a choice. She could marry to France, she could marry to wherever. But her father wanted at this point, you know, they chopped and changed whether the alliance was with France, whether it was with Scotland, who it was with. But at this particular point, he wanted the alliance to be with Scotland, so she was married off to James IV, brought here to Linlithgow, and which had been beautifully done up for her. And she had this little bower up here, and there's a little room up there, and she would sit in that little room.
So you can that room that you can still see at the top of the tower, it pushes up above the roof line, and you can see, so it's like an octagonal, a little octagonal room. So that really was...
Yes, so there's a little stone bench inside.
Oh, how wonderful.
And she would sit up there and watch for her husband coming back from battle. It's all couched very romantically.
Yes.
But I don't know how much romance was there, because James IV had a number of mistresses, which he kept on kind of seeing while Margaret was around. She was there to do one job, and she did. I think she had 6 children or something, but only one lived to adulthood, which was her son James, which was all that was needed.
Well, you only need one.
That's it. So anyway, she's up on that tower. They've been married for 10 years, and he's gone off to fight. But this time, the allegiance, Henry VIII's now on the throne, and they're fighting. So, you know, Scotland and England are at war again. Yes. So James goes off to, actually Henry's not around at this point. Henry's actually gone off to fight with the French, so he's fighting with everybody at this point. And it's actually Catherine of Aragon who's the regent.
Of course it
she
is, yes.
orchestrates all this. So James, they fight a place just in the north of England, Flodden, the Battle of Flodden, and James is killed at the battle. So
was he the last Scottish king to sort of go into battle, like Richard III was the last English king?
He was, yes,
okay.
yeah, because James, his son, learned that lesson and he wasn't at his battle. So, so he dies at the Battle of Flodden. So he was a very superstitious man, James IV, and he'd. I don't want to go into too much detail about the previous Stuarts, but for whatever reasons his father died, and all his life he wore kind of a scourge belt round him. He was trying to atone for things, and he would go on pilgrimages and all sorts of things. But supposedly the night before battle, whether this was real orchestrated or real or not, he saw an apparition in St Michael's Church there that told him not to go off to battle, but he went anyway, and he was killed. So Margaret's watching for him coming home. Having said all that, she's sitting up there looking out that way. He wouldn't have come home that way.
So there is a bit of a flaw in the story.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, so of course he doesn't come home from Flodden. So his son at 17 months is the king.
Yeah.
So often happened in
So
Scotland.
another
the baby was the
infant,
king.
an infant child.
It was very common in
Yeah.
Scotland. So she, it was agreed that papers were drawn up by all the lords at the time that she would be the regent as long as she didn't remarry.
I
But
see.
Margaret, and I quite like looking at parallels with Margaret Tudor and Mary Queen of Scots, because Margaret didn't waste a lot of time. She was young, I think she was feisty, she was quite like good time girl, I think, basically. She went off against her brother, Henry VIII's wishes, and she married a man called Archibald Douglas. He was the Earl of Angus, basically because he'd suddenly become the Earl, because most of the Scottish nobles had been killed at Culloden. At Flodden.
Oh, so yes, opportunity abounds.
Yes, but he was described, his uncle described him as a witless fool. And then his...
I wonder what
Yeah.
Margaret saw in him then.
well, I think what she saw in him was, another description was, he was very lusty.
Oh, I see. Say no more.
So Margaret, so she's had her son, James, with James IV. So she's no longer regent because she's gone and remarried. And so, but all sorts of things go on then. But she does have a daughter with Archibald Douglas. Now, they're estranged. They eventually get divorced and she goes off and marries again. But she's had this daughter. And this daughter has a son, who is Henry Lord Darnley. So that's Mary Queen of Scots' second husband.
Wow.
So Mary Queen of Scots describes Henry Lord Darnley as the lustiest, best proportioned lang mang she has ever seen. So we have the lusty thread going on there.
Yes,
and I think
I
some
see
of the
that.
lords would probably have described Darnley as a witless fool as well. So
There's
a bit in his grandfather's footsteps there.
Definitely a family trait thing going on there, isn't there?
So, so this lovely oriel window that you can see sticking out here, this is...
Anne is laughing slightly here because unfortunately the northern side of the palace has scaffolding on it at the moment, so we're having to use our imagination.
Yes.
But Anne, do your best to describe
Yes.
what it is we're looking at.
I shall take you down here, and the interpretation board's still here, so you can see a little bit of a picture of what is
So
going
I
on.
just want to paint a picture as we're walking down the path here, because
beautiful.
right in front of me is the loch that the palace sits on a raised hillock overlooking the loch, and there's some beautiful trees and parkland around it. It's a little misty today, but I can certainly see why it was a very, very pleasant place to build your
It was
palace.
absolutely beautiful, you know, so here.
So we're in front of a kind of an information board
Yes.
here, so tell me what we're looking at.
So this is the north range of Linlithgow Palace. So this, and there's an interesting thing that's on here. So this range, when James VI left and moved to London, he didn't take much to do with it until he got a letter from Lord Livingston, who were the keepers of Linlithgow Palace. So it's actually the Livingstons that lived here more than anybody else.
I see.
So it said, look, it's in lovely old Scots.
Yes,
so,
go for it.
6th of September, betwixt 3 and 4 in the morning, the north quarter of your Majesty's Palace of Linlithgow is falling down. So, and it might damage your fountain. So basically it was falling down. So he did pay. That was his one contribution. He paid to get this range rebuilt, and it was built. Looks very different from the rest of the palace because it was actually built as loads of guest rooms, and that's why you see, you know, there's a consistency of just lots of rooms.
So there's how many levels at this? Because it's really tall, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, there's
So
what,
there's
5, 6
yeah,
levels?
it's a real rabbit warren of a place. So down underneath you've got lots of cellars and things like that, in the kitchens, and then you have really, what's the first floor, just with that. I know it's a recording, but where the green hoarding is, that's the main floor. So that's really the king's. You can just see the oriel window just sticking out there. So that's the main floor. So that would be the king's floor, and then the floor up above that would be the queen's floors, and then up above that would be, you know, the maids and ladies in waiting and important dignitaries and things like that. So it does have about 5, 6 floors, but it's only actually this side that you can see all the levels like that, because when you go around you'll see the Great Hall takes up the whole thing, basically.
It's impressive, and as you say, there is this beautiful oriel window which is sitting on the northwest tower,
Yep.
which is where we were talking about the kind of the end of the royal apartment.
Yes.
So I guess that's
these rooms here are the bed chamber. So You obviously come through the difference, the outer chamber, the presence chamber, and then finally, if you're really in the inner circle, you're in the bed chamber.
Absolutely.
So this is the room here. So not so much on this level, because this would be the king's level. So the queen would be up above. So that's where both Mary, Queen of Scots, and her father, James V, were born. They were both born right there.
Quite amazing. So we think it obviously in the bedchamber in that tower.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. That's great.
So just right in there.
Okay. So Mary didn't stay though very long at Linlithgow, did she?
Say she was born on the 8th of December. When she was 6 days old, her father died at Falkland Palace. Now, they're not sure what he died of, but it's some sort of great depression, great melancholy, and they basically say he turned to the wall and he died. Now, but before he died, he made a prophecy. And his prophecy was, he said, it can we alas, and it'll gang we alas. And what he was saying was the Stuart dynasty came with a girl, which it did indeed, Marjorie Bruce, Robert the Bruce's daughter, who married the first Stuart, and it'll gang we alas. And he was saying he was so disappointed he'd had a girl. His wife, Marie Stuart, had 2 boys before, but they hadn't survived.
And I read this recently. They died on the same day the previous year.
They did, the same day. And one, that was the day of his birth. And the other one was like a year or so, I know, it was heartbreaking.
Absolutely heartbreaking.
I mean, her story is a heartbreaking story because she had to leave. She had another son, a great, hale and hearty son, and she had to leave him behind in France.
Did she ever see him again?
No.
Gosh.
No, it was all letters and things, so... I know.
The women made some incredible sacrifices.
They absolutely did.
Not that they always had say in it, but...
I know. Oh, they did, I know. So anyway, so he said that. So the dynasty did die with a woman, but it wasn't Mary, Queen of Scots. It was nearly 200 years later, and it was Queen Anne. So that's it. So she's queen. She's 6 days old. Now, it's been quite common for an infant to be king or queen. She's only queen, but king in Scotland. So there's a tussle for power. Whoever controls the baby is the power. So there's a lot of that goes on.
In the form of a regency.
In a regency, yeah. So on his deathbed, poor King James was signed this, I don't know if it was his will or a proclamation or whatever, by Cardinal Beaton. Now, Cardinal Beaton was one of the powers at the time. He was a Catholic cardinal. He was very strong to a lot of things. So he got the king to sign this, and the debate is whether he actually held the king's hand and wrote it on to say that on the king's death there wouldn't be a regency as such, there'd be a guardianship, and it would be 4 people: himself, Cardinal Beaton, the Earl of Murray, who's Mary Queen of Scots' older half-brother, the illegitimate son of James V, the Earl of Huntly, who was the controlled the north of Scotland. He was from up in Aberdeen. He was a Catholic peer. The Earl of Argyll, who controlled all the west and the Isles, Colwyn, and that's 4. So that was what he wanted. Scotland, unlike England, you'll notice that we say Mary Queen of Scots, not Mary Queen of Scotland. And the reason for that is the Scottish kings they weren't kings of the land, they were kings of the people.
Oh, how interesting.
Okay.
Is this something to do with the clan?
Not really, no. See, Scotland never had, whereas England had like an autocracy, and what the king said went, and they kind of deferred to Parliament when they needed a bit of money for something. In Scotland, they always had the Parliament. So the kings and queens would say what they wanted, but they had to put things to Parliament to kind of get them through. So the Parliament and the other lords always had a say. They couldn't necessarily just do exactly what they wanted, and they were kings of the people. That's from the time of Robert the Bruce, rather than in England it was all about the land. It was about the land in Scotland as well, because all these lords wanted land grabs everywhere. It always was. So so they wanted the control of the baby. But the Parliament didn't allow it. The Parliament said, no, we're going to have the regent who should be the next in line to the throne, who was the Earl of Arran, and he was of the Hamilton family. So the Hamilton family, after the Stuarts, were the next in line to the throne. So he became the regent, the Earl of Arran, and not these 4.
just want to pause the story there, because there's some enormous architectural feature in front of me, which looks like it's propping up the side of a wall. What
Basically,
we've got 3 arches,
yes, that's
haven't
exactly
we?
what it's doing.
Okay.
So, well, this was an addition from James IV. And what these are buttresses, and they would have had towers on them. And if you were at a castle, that would be a big defensive feature. Here it was more decorative. But they are adding extra support to the side that's weaker because of the hillside.
Because of the hillside, because the hill is sloping away, isn't it? It's on very uneven ground.
It is, yes. Now, back in the time of Mary Queen of Scots, this wouldn't have been here. The loch came right round here.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so this huge bit of park here, this part of the peel is reclaimed land.
Yeah, so the grass in front, we're facing a large expanse of grass directly in front of us, but you're saying that was once flooded and it would have gone, the loch would have gone right
so
almost.
So it came round almost like 3 sides almost, you know, go quite round. So this side that we're coming round to now is the original entrance to Linlithgow Palace.
Ah, I see. So that would explain, you've got these 2 kind of round, they're obviously the bases of 2 round towers, are they?
And then at the side,
oh, I see.
Extra,
yes, and then you've got the yes, I can see.
Because, by the time, well, when James V came along, he built the other entrance, so.
So, Anne, we've now come round to the East Range, and there's a beautiful gateway in front of us. So tell us about this.
Okay. So this gateway that you can see here right in the middle, this is the original entrance to Linlithgow Palace. So you would come from Edinburgh, which is over that way.
How far away is Edinburgh?
Edinburgh, Holyrood Palace specifically in Edinburgh is 17 miles from Linlithgow Palace. Stirling Castle is 17 miles from Linlithgow Palace. It's exactly halfway between the two.
Very convenient.
Okay, so it was a fabulous stop-off point. So this is the original gateway, and there would have been 2 huge statues in those plinths on either side, probably St Andrew and St Michael. St Andrew, the patron saint of Scotland, St Michael, patron saint of Linlithgow. And that's the coat of arms, Stuart coat of arms, that you can see still outlined on the top. And it would have had a drawbridge and a wooden walkway coming right down. And you can actually see what it might have looked like in a very strange place. In 2012, Chanel held their annual fashion show here in Linlithgow. They just bought a Scottish knitwear company, so they wanted to do their so they took this over. It was crazy. But they had big marquees down here for the after show entertainment, and they rebuilt
the drawbridge.
Walkway coming down from there.
So where can we see this? Is it still?
Just Google it.
Google it and you'll find it.
Yeah.
Well, there you go, folks.
Yeah, there you go.
Google for a great reconstruction.
I know. You'll see how the steps looked coming down here. So that would be the original entrance there. And this side of the palace, like that huge window you can see there, most of the windows here, even the ones up the top, they all lead into the Great Hall. The Great Hall here is massive. I'm convinced it's the largest, but I'm told the one in Stirling is larger. I think that's partly because it has no roof. It gives a feeling of
of being more bigger than it is.
It has an amazing fireplace, though, that's supposedly one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in the UK. It's basically 3 fireplaces put together.
Wow.
Absolutely stunning. So it's an amazing room. As I say, the whole place was built for entertainment. The room, the window there with the cross hashes, for the window pane, see inside, that was the court kitchen. So they had a separate kitchen. They had the palace kitchen for everybody, and they had a separate one just for the Great Hall. But I love these windows because that is the original crosses for the window panes, and they would have had glass.
Oh yes, beautiful. Yeah, that's fantastic.
Yeah, so it's amazing. So that's the original side, just right here, and then you can see the huge chimneys for the great fires.
Oh yes, right, absolutely. And is that where that fireplace goes up to, as you were mentioning? So right, okay. Now we started talking about the fact that Mary wasn't here that long. She was moved.
Yes.
Maybe you want to tell us about why that came about.
So what happened was, as I say, she was the Queen, 6 days old. So power struggle starts. So it was decided. So there wasn't only the Earl of Arran who was the regent, and there was Beaton and his guys who wanted to take over. There was also another branch of the Stuart family with a claim to the throne, and that was the Lennox Stuarts. They eventually go on to be another one of Margaret Douglas's husbands, but there we go. So the Lennox Stuarts are tussling, they want the baby as well. So it's decided Linlithgow, being a palace, hasn't got much in the way of fortifications, so it's not safe enough for her. So she's taken to Stirling Castle when she's just 6 months old.
Right.
Okay, so she's only here till she's 6 months old.
Yeah.
And then she's at Stirling till she's 5.
And I read that when Mary returned to Scotland in 1561, I mean, she did visit Linlithgow, but it wasn't really her favourite palace, wasn't it?
No, Holyrood was. So when she came back, when she was 18 years later, so she took up residence at Holyrood. I mean, she did come to Linlithgow several times, but it was more
in passing
through.
Yeah.
Unlike her mother, like Marie de Guise loved Linlithgow, she stayed here. Her grandmother, Margaret Tudor, stayed here. Even Mary's granddaughter, who you might not know, but she's very important, Elizabeth, James VI's oldest daughter, she was brought up here. So Mary was kind of unusual. She was the only one that
didn't really take to the place.
But Mary travelled about a whole lot. I mean, I think always have to remember that Mary's time back in Scotland was 6 years, and she packed an awful lot into those 6 years. So,
so she was travelling a lot.
She travelled a huge amount. I mean, the one major significant event that took place related to Linlithgow once Mary came back again was that she was leaving Linlithgow to go back to Holyrood Palace when she was abducted by the Earl of Bothwell.
Oh, this is the Bothwell incident. So she was leaving Linlithgow.
She was leaving Linlithgow. Now, you'll read a bit in history and it'll talk about she was abducted at Linlithgow Bridge. Now, there is an actual Linlithgow Bridge and there was a battle of Linlithgow Bridge. Linlithgow Bridge is, in fact, part of our town's called Linlithgow Bridge. It's east, it's west. So it wasn't there. Nobody knows exactly, but we think it was probably a bridge that is now basically the runway of Edinburgh Airport.
Right.
So it's over there. So there's no lovely historic bridge
a shame.
You can go and have a look at. So yeah. So that was the last connection that she had with Linlithgow.
So I think that concludes our story of Mary here at Linlithgow. Thank you so much, Anne. But I'm going to be I want to ask you 4 questions that maybe add a little personal touch about what you feel about Mary. So what would you say are Mary's most ennobling characteristics?
Well, on an actual physical level, Mary was 5'11", so she had stature and she had carriage. Actually, her mother was 6'1", so they're very tall.
Ooh.
And that's why it was important for Darnley to be taller. But so she had the stature, she had the character, so she looked the part. She was very noble that way. And I think she was kind of noble within herself in that, you know, I mean, a lot is made of the messes that she made, but when she arrived in Scotland, she was quite a conciliatory character. I mean, she was a Catholic, but the country was Protestant, and she wasn't going to try and change anything, and she kind of wooed the Lords. I think she was very charismatic. So I think from that standpoint, I mean, it all went horribly wrong, but I think to start off with, she probably had that kind of nobility about her. So,
well, talking of the going horribly wrong, what do you think was her greatest flaw?
Well, it's the obvious one, isn't it? Her taste in men. You know, which is very obvious, you know, but I think the more you look at it, and I've done various talks on that, the men in Mary's life, and not necessarily just the husbands, but, you know, all of the men contribute some way or another, you know.
It didn't go so well around men, did it? No. Things could have been very different if it was just not for the men, but anyway, okay. But how should we remember Mary, do you think?
Well.
Oh, and we've got the bells, the bells that you were talking about.
That's right, yeah. They'll chime 11 times, won't they, because it's 11 o'clock.
Of course. Just as we're asking how we should remember Mary, the bells ring. Yep. Oh my goodness, I've gone all goosebumpy.
It's only one, so I don't know which one it is. It'll either be the Alma Maria or the Great Michael, so there you go.
There you go.
So, yes, Mary herself kind of orchestrated her memory in a way, didn't she? Because she wanted to be, and she is kind of seen as this great martyr, and to quite an extreme extent in some cases. And I think that was very clever, actually. You know, I think she was more savvy than people made out, because she was ill, so she just died quietly in her bed. Probably nobody would really know much who she was. But that's probably how she wanted to be remembered. How do I remember what I remembered? It's more about her legacy, I think, because, you know, when you think about it, and I know this is a Tudor thing, but the Tudors were only around for what, 100 odd years?
Yeah.
Something like that. The Stuarts, when they were kings and queens of Great Britain, that was like 200 odd years. If you add on the time they were in Scotland as well, you get 300 odd years. So it's a huge legacy, and her legacy, you know, like her son and everything that came from that. So I think to try and remember more, rather than just focus on the turbulent times, which I think are very dramatic and they make for great stories, and it's fabulous. I'm glad it brings an interest to that. But I think I'd rather remember more her legacy came after, which again was equally turbulent and fun, but it lends itself to great stories. So.
And you know, these historic characters, I mean, you're probably aware Anne Boleyn is my historical heroine, and I know Mary is yours. They mean something to us. So what does she mean to you on a very personal level?
Well, on a very personal level, right now, Mary means a huge amount to me, because our tour company is called Mary's Meanders. It's called after Mary, Queen of Scots, because we're based here in Linlithgow, and we literally meander in the footsteps of Mary, Queen of Scots. We do various other things now as well, but that's our starting point. And I've had an interest in Mary since I was young, and I love being here in this town and everything there is about it. And so it's very, very personal, and I just love all her stories. And I'm finding out, I'm not, as I said at the beginning, I'm not a historian. I don't have a degree in Mary, Queen of Scots. I haven't done it for years, so it's just a passion and an interest. And I'm finding out, I've come to this late in life, had various different careers, so I'm finding out new things all the time, and I just love finding out all these new things. There's always something different happens, or a wee snippet. I'm very good at going down rabbit holes when you start looking at something, and you find out all sorts of interesting things, not just about Mary's life and the lives of the people around her as well. And you go to all these amazing buildings, and more or less every castle in Scotland's got some connection with Mary, Queen of Scots, or they claim to have somewhere or another. So there's always something new you can find out. So yeah.
But you're living your passion now, aren't you?
I am absolutely living my passion.
And that is just wonderful.
It's just fantastic.
So just before we go, maybe if people are thinking of visiting Linlithgow, obviously there is the palace, but what else must they see, or do you encourage them to go and see?
Well, I encourage people to simply take a walk along Linlithgow High Street, because you'll see everything there. So you have everything from, we start at the Star and Garter, an old 17th, 18th century coaching inn at one side. You'll see where the original walls of the town were. You'll walk along, you'll see 17th century buildings. Hamilton's Land, it was the townhouse of the Dukes of Hamilton, the Hamiltons that feature a lot in Mary's story. You can come further along, you'll see Victorian architecture, you'll see some 1960s architecture. You'll see the old court, you'll see the spot where Mary's brother, the Earl of Murray, was assassinated. So there's so much to see actually in the town. You'll see the old town well, the old borough halls, traditional 17th century borough halls. So just the whole architecture and the stories of the town. You can actually you can download it, or you can get a paper copy of a heritage map that you can follow and go around the town. And if you've got lots of time in your hand, you can even take a little walk up one of the side streets and you'll find yourself at the canal. So there's a lovely canal and a canal basin there as well, so lovely walks. So and there's lots to see here.
And I imagine, although it's a misty, bit of a drizzly day today, on a beautiful sunny day, you could bring a picnic into the grounds here and enjoy the loch.
And if you come here and you want to see the palace, you can walk right round the loch. It takes about an hour to walk right round, and you get the views from the other side as well. It's a lovely, lovely walk.
Well, thank you so much, Anne.
You're very welcome.
It's been a wonderful experience. Thank you for sharing all your knowledge and your passion about Mary with us.
Thank you for coming. I love when people are going to show us off to the world. So.
And now we're off for lunch, aren't we? At the
We're
Four
going
Marys.
to the Four Marys, which is another story.
Okay, so from here, folks, we are going to be going on to Stirling this afternoon, where we'll be meeting another member of the Marie Stuart Society, the president, Liz Manson, and she's going to tell us all about the next stop for Mary. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to that tour of Linlithgow and the tales of the early years of Mary as much as I did recording it. I just want to thank one more time the hugely knowledgeable Anne Daly of Mary's Meanders. Now, if you want to find out more about Anne and her tours, I'll put a link in the description below this podcast. And as I mentioned at the outset of this episode, Anne runs incredibly popular Outlander tours for all of those fans of the programme out there, and I know there will be many of you. And she's also able to assist you if you want to delve deeper into your Scottish ancestry with on-site tours to places with connections to your Scottish roots. As you also heard in the programme, COVID, of course, has had a big impact on heritage sites on both sides of the border. But I am delighted to be able to announce that historic Scotland sites are reopening all across Scotland as we speak. And so if you want to find out what's open near to you and what safety measures are in place and the benefits of becoming a Historic Scotland member, then do go along to their website at historicreopening.scot. Again, I'll put a link in the descriptive text associated with the podcast. And of course, finally, I'll be running my own In the Footsteps of Mary Queen of Scots tour next year from the 20th to the 24th of June. Now, I'll say more about that at the end of this month. But in the meantime, if you do want to find out more information, you can visit my tour page at www.thetudortravelguide.com/tours. And yes, you guessed it, folks, I'll put another link in the description below. So you should be able to find links of lots of different things that we've been talking about today, should you be interested. Okay, well, that is indeed the end of this week's podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to next week when we continue our adventure as we travel to Stirling Castle, the gateway to the Highlands. Until then, my time travelling friends, all that remains for me to say, as ever, is happy time travelling.